The entire story of Greek mythology for America. vs. China. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're not just drifting back. We're drifting sideways. Across oceans, across empires, and across two very different versions of the same old question. Where did all this come from? So, if your blanket's pulled up, your phone brightness is low, and your brain feels pleasantly fuzzy, we're going to travel, not through time exactly, but through belief, through the world of gods, chaos, and creation, as seen by the Greeks and by the Chinese. It's like watching two civilizations dream the same dream, but in very different accents. Because in the end, both cultures looked at the same night sky and decided that someone must be in charge of it. Let's start with the Greeks, who, like most ancient people, believed the world began with a mess. They called it chaos. Not chaos as in your desk or American politics, but a formless void, an infinite soup of everything and nothing, floating around awkwardly, waiting for someone to do something about it. Out of that void came Gaia, the earth, and Uranos, the sky. They were the first power couple, though romance might be a generous term. He smothered her. She plotted revenge. You know, the usual start to a healthy divine relationship. Together, they gave birth to the Titans, vast, moody, slightly dysfunctional beings with names like Oceanus, Hyperion, and Kronos. Kronos, by the way, was the sort of child who thanked his parents by cutting off his father's authority. Let's call it that. Naturally, this didn't end well, but it did set a pattern. In Greek myth, power never passes peacefully. Every generation overthrows the one before it, and every new ruler insists they'll do better, and then immediately prove that they won't. Now, let's drift eastward, thousands of miles and a few centuries sideways to early China. There, the beginning wasn't chaos exactly. It was the chaos egg, which, to be fair, is a more organized sort of chaos. Inside it floated Pangu, a giant whose job was basically everything. When he woke up, he stretched, as you do, and split the egg. The heavy parts became earth. The light parts rose to become heaven. And Pangu stood between them, arms out, keeping the world from collapsing back into mush. For 18,000 years, he pushed them apart. And when he finally grew tired, understandably, he lay down and died. His breath became wind, his voice thunder, his blood rivers, and his body the mountains.
This vintage is exceptional.
You have to admit, that's a level of work ethic you don't see much anymore. So right from the start, we see the contrast. The Greeks imagined creation as a family feud. The Chinese imagined it as construction work, both impressive, both exhausting, but one involved fewer amputations. Back in Greece, Kronos ruled after defeating his father. But of course, he had his own parental anxieties. A prophecy warned him that one of his children would overthrow him. So he did what any well-adjusted father would do. He ate them. One by one, the newborn gods disappeared, swallowed whole, like divine vitamin pills, except for one, Zeus. His mother, Rhea, smuggled him away to a cave and replaced him with a stone wrapped in cloth. Kronos, apparently not a careful eater, didn't notice. Zeus grew up in secret, fed on honey and goat's milk, which sounds like an early influencer diet. And when he came of age, he forced his father to regurgitate all the swallowed siblings, now full-grown, and presumably very annoyed. And just like that, the Olympian gods were born. A slightly traumatized, highly dramatic family destined to spend eternity arguing about power, love, and whose turn it was to ruin humanity. Meanwhile, in China, things were calmer. Instead of one cosmic soap opera, creation led to a whole heavenly bureaucracy. Where the Greeks had Olympus, a mountain of thunder and egos, the Chinese had the celestial court. And at its head sat the Jade Emperor. He didn't eat his children or hurl lightning bolts at mortals. He managed heaven the way one might manage a slow, eternal government office. There were departments, registries, celestial accountants, and minor gods who probably spent eternity filling out divine paperwork. The Jade Emperor didn't overthrow anyone. He earned his post through virtue and patience, which tells you everything about the moral priorities of each culture. The Greeks loved rebellion. The Chinese admired order. Both were right, and both, inevitably, went wrong. Now, the Olympians, Zeus and company, were not exactly paragons of virtue. Zeus himself was a walking scandal. Married to Hera, but romantically. Involved with approximately everyone else, he left behind an entire mythological population of demigods, monsters, and very confused mothers. The Greeks never seemed embarrassed by this. They treated divine chaos the same way we treat weather. Inconvenient, but normal. If Zeus transformed into a swan to seduce someone, that wasn't divine misconduct, it was Tuesday. The Chinese, by contrast, preferred gods who stayed in their lane. You had the dragon kings of the four seas, who controlled rain. The kitchen god, who reported household behavior to heaven. And Guan Yin, the merciful goddess who answered prayers and helped lost souls. Their myths were less about passion and punishment, more about balance, keeping heaven and earth running smoothly. If Greek mythology was a soap opera, Chinese mythology was a public service announcement. Still, both civilizations agreed on one thing. Mortals were disappointing. To the Greeks, humans were either too proud or too foolish. Prometheus gave them fire. A noble act, but a terrible idea. Zeus punished him by chaining him to a rock, where an eagle ate his liver daily. You'd think that after the first few thousand years, he'd stop regenerating. But no, Greek myths are nothing if not committed to suffering. The Chinese had their own version of this. In their stories, humans were molded from yellow clay by the goddess Nua. But when heaven collapsed after a great cosmic battle, it was Nua who repaired the sky, not to punish humans, but to protect them. Where Greek gods punished, Chinese gods patched. Different styles of management. Same exhausted humanity. Let's take a quiet breath here. Imagine these two worlds existing at the same time. Greece surrounded by the sea. China wrapped in mountains and mist. Two civilizations, never meeting, but somehow dreaming the same cosmic logic. that the world was made by something vast, flawed, and vaguely parental. The Greeks gave their world drama. The Chinese gave theirs stability, and both gave us stories that refuse to die. Because what they were really writing about wasn't gods. It was themselves. Humans trying to make sense of why the universe is so magnificent and so unfair at the same time. Zeus and the Jade Emperor would never have been friends. Zeus would have stormed into heaven demanding tribute and thunder. The Jade Emperor would have quietly reassigned him to a department of weather management and gone back to his tea. But they shared something profound. They both ruled worlds that reflected human society. Greek gods were powerful but petty. Chinese gods were serene but bureaucratic. Different temperaments, same truth. Power always mirrors the people who imagine it. Now, let's drift downward, into the human realm again. Because no matter which mythology you read, the relationship between gods and mortals always goes wrong. In Greece, hubris, pride, was the cardinal sin. A mortal who challenged a god, or even got too confident, was doomed. Arachne, the weaver, was turned into a spider for daring to outdo Athena. Niobe, who bragged about her children, saw them all struck down. And Icarus, of course, flew too close to the sun, proving that ancient myths and modern parenting have the same energy. Don't touch that. In China, it wasn't pride that doomed people. It was imbalance. Mortals who disrupted harmony. By greed, by violence, by defying the cosmic order, invited disaster. Floods, droughts, and plagues weren't punishments from vengeful gods. They were signs that the world itself had fallen out of tune. The moral was clear. In Greece, don't challenge the gods. In China, don't disturb the balance. As we drift toward the edge of this part of the story, think about how strange it is that two cultures so far apart reached the same conclusion, that divinity isn't kindness or even justice. It's inevitability, an endless pattern of creation and correction, of chaos and order. And maybe that's why these stories still lull us, because they remind us that even in our smallness, we're part of a rhythm that's older than memory, a rhythm of falling, rebuilding, and starting over. So tonight, as you drift, imagine the gods of both worlds watching the same night sky. Zeus on his mountain, thunder in hand. The Jade Emperor in his palace, stars arranged like scrolls before him, both gazing down at Earth, confused, tired, slightly disappointed, yet endlessly patient with the strange little creatures who keep telling stories about them. Young royals rarely played outside. It was considered undignified to get dirty. Their toys were miniature thrones. Their games involved protocol, and their bedtime stories usually ended with, "And then he was crowned." When visitors met these children, they described them as angelic, solemn, or the quiet machinery of witch hunts tonight. We're drifting back to a world where fear and faith mixed like smoke and incense. A world where illness meant sin, bad weather meant curses, and every odd neighbor was one goat short of being accused of witchcraft. So, if you've dimmed the lights and settled in, let's talk about how witches, real or imagined, were actually killed. Because when we picture witch trials, our minds usually jump to bonfires and screaming crowds. But the truth? Most of it was slower, colder, and disturbingly procedural. The bureaucracy of belief. It's tempting to think of witch hunts as pure chaos. Angry mobs chasing old women through muddy streets. But in many places, it wasn't mob rule at all. It was paperwork, accusations, depositions, clerks with quills scratching by candlelight, writing maleficium, Latin for evil-doing. The European witch craze, which peaked between the 15th and 17th centuries, wasn't really one big wave of madness. It was more like a drizzle of paranoia that lasted for centuries. Some regions burned thousands, others barely any. It depended less on superstition and more on who ran the local court. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire's fragmented system meant hundreds of small jurisdictions, each with its own judge, and its own level of hysteria. Meanwhile, in England, witch trials were rare and tightly controlled. The English preferred hanging. The Germans preferred burning. The Scots, being pragmatic, alternated, and it all began, almost always, the same way, with a complaint. The complaint. My cow died. Probably a witch. Picture a small village. The year is 1587. Your cow refuses to give milk. Your baby has a fever. Your neighbor Agnes has been muttering to herself again. Coincidence? Of course not. You tell the local magistrate, who sighs and writes down your statement. Soon witnesses are gathered. They all have something to add. She looked at me funny. She spoiled the butter. She has a cat. By the time the court is involved, Agnes doesn't stand much of a chance. Most witchcraft accusations weren't about black magic at all. They were about community tension, envy, and bad luck looking for a face. The accused were overwhelmingly women, usually widows, healers, or anyone who didn't quite fit in. They lived on the edges of society, and eventually, society came for them. The arrest? Suspicion of maleficium. When someone was formally accused, they were arrested, though arrested is a generous term. It meant being taken from your home by constables, or sometimes even by neighbors, and confined in a local cell or barn. The search came next. Authorities would strip the accused and inspect them for a witch's mark, any mole, wart, or scar that could be interpreted as a sign of demonic contact. In some cases, midwives were brought in to examine the body. If they found a spot that didn't bleed when pricked, that was proof. Never mind that many birthmarks don't bleed. Science wasn't exactly thriving in the 16th century. In England, they might also watch the accused for days, no sleep, no rest, to see if her familiar would appear to feed on her blood. Any insect that entered the room was considered suspect. It's worth noting that almost all of these women confessed eventually. but not because they were witches, because sleep deprivation, humiliation, and fear have a way of unraveling anyone. The confession. Say the words, and you might live. Confession was everything. Without it, a witch trial was incomplete. In theory, confession brought redemption. In practice, it made paperwork easier. Sometimes the accused were persuaded through gentle methods, fasting, prayer, or constant interrogation. Other times, persuasion involved thumbscrews, ropes, and water. The Church technically forbade torture in many regions, but there were loopholes. One could suspend the accused by the arms until the joints dislocated. Not torture, they claimed, just encouragement. Some confessed immediately, hoping for mercy. Some named others, neighbors, midwives, family. That's how witch hunts spread. Not through demons, but through despair. Because, once you were accused, the only way to prove your innocence was to help the system find another witch. The trials. Proof beyond reason. Contrary to popular belief, not all witch trials were fiery spectacles. Most were somber administrative affairs, long tables, candlelight, magistrates, clerks, and a trembling defendant. Evidence was flexible. A witness might claim you cursed their cow, or that their beer soured after you looked at it. That was often enough. If you had a reputation for healing, that was suspicious. If you were poor, easy target. If you were rich, clearly you had used magic to get there. You see the problem. Some courts used ordeals to test guilt. The most famous was the swimming test. The accused was tied and thrown into water. If she floated, the water had rejected her. Guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. And dead. It wasn't common everywhere, but it did happen, mostly in rural parts of England and Central Europe. It wasn't technically an execution, though it often ended like one. By the time the sentence was handed down, there was rarely any doubt about the outcome. The machinery had already done its work. The sentencing. In the name of God and the law. Witchcraft was usually treated as both a crime and a sin. You had offended not only your neighbors, but also heaven itself. Punishment, therefore, had to cleanse the soul and protect the public. Hanging, burning, or, in Scotland, strangling and then burning were the standard methods. Each region had its own sense of style. In France and Germany, witches were typically burned alive. In England, they were hanged, like ordinary criminals. In Scandinavia, the method varied, sometimes burning, sometimes beheading. The sentence was often read aloud in public. It was meant to be both terrifying and reassuring. The devil was being purged. And by morning, life would go on. The execution, a cleansing flame. Let's drift, just for a moment, to a cold square in Würzburg, around 1629. A stake stands in the center, surrounded by bundles of straw. The condemned woman, one of hundreds executed during that city's witch panic, is bound to the post. A priest murmurs prayers. The crowd watches silently. A torch is lowered. It's easy to imagine this as a moment of fury and shouting, but often it was eerily calm. By the time an execution took place, the accused had already confessed, repented, and been absolved. The burning was simply the final act, the physical removal of sin. And in that strange moral logic, the condemned was no longer a monster, but a soul being purified. Records show that many prayed aloud as the fire rose. Some were strangled first, as a small mercy. Others were not. No one screamed that this was wrong, because to them it wasn't. That's the most haunting part. It wasn't madness. It was order, a system, working exactly as designed. The aftermath. Ashes and silence. After the fire went out, the ashes were gathered and buried outside town limits. Sometimes a marker was left. Usually there wasn't. The crowd dispersed. The scribes closed their ledgers, and life carried on, with one fewer neighbor. In time, a new misfortune would happen. Another cow would die. Another storm would ruin a harvest. And the cycle would begin again. Because witch trials were never really about witches. They were about fear. The human need to assign blame when the world doesn't make sense. And in the 16th century, the world made very little sense indeed. The clergy's dilemma. Holy men and hidden doubts, to be fair. Not every priest or magistrate believed in witchcraft. Some quietly doubted the whole thing. A few even spoke against it. One German cleric wrote that witches exist only in the imagination of fools. He was promptly accused of being one himself. The Church's stance was inconsistent. The Catholic Inquisition, for instance, was sometimes more skeptical than local courts, preferring confession over combustion. They saw witchcraft as heresy, yes, but they also understood how unreliable evidence could be. Meanwhile, Protestant regions, which prided themselves on scriptural purity, often went harder on witches. Without confession, without penance, there was only punishment. It's an irony that still lingers. The Reformation, meant to purify faith, sometimes made fear worse. The witch manuals. How to catch a sorceress. And of course, every bureaucracy needs a manual. The most famous was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It was a masterpiece of paranoia disguised as theology. It claimed that witches were mostly women, more carnal than men, as it delicately put it, and provided step-by-step guidance for spotting, questioning, and condemning them. The Reader book became a bestseller, second only to the Bible in parts of Europe. which tells you everything you need to know about the reading habits of the 16th century. It was banned, then reprinted, then banned again. And yet it kept resurfacing. Because fear, once written down, is hard to unlearn. The irony of innocence if you survived an accusation, and some did. Your life was never quite the same. You might be exiled. You might flee to another town. But rumors followed like smoke. And the people who accused you? They rarely faced any consequence. It was safer to be wrong about a witch than right about your own ignorance. The story of witch trials isn't really about fire and pitchforks. It's about loneliness, suspicion, and systems designed to keep everyone afraid of everyone else. The Orphans of Thrones, What Happened to the Children of Fallen Kings. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when crowns weighed a little too heavy. And being born royal wasn't so much a privilege as it was a prelude to exile, imprisonment, or, occasionally, beheading. So, if you've dimmed the lights and settled under something warm, let's talk about what happened to the children of fallen kings, because when the crown fell, it rarely landed quietly, and it almost never spared the family. The unluckiest job in history. Being a royal heir, being born the child of a king, sounds glamorous. You get palaces, jewels, tutors, exotic pets, and servants whose entire purpose is to bow at you until their knees hurt. But the truth? You were a political weapon wrapped in lace. The moment your father lost a war, or even sneezed at the wrong time, your life became collateral damage, because royal children weren't just offspring. They were bargaining chips. They were living insurance policies. And history is full of examples of exactly how badly that could go wrong. Let's start with one of the most haunting royal childhoods in history. The sad little boys in the Tower of London. The princes in the Tower. When bedtime meant possible murder, our story begins with Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. They were the sons of King Edward IV of England, a man who'd fought his way to the throne during the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long family feud between the houses of York and Lancaster. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, his eldest son, Edward V, was just 12. And as we all know, 12-year-olds are famously bad at running medieval kingdoms. Enter their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who promised to protect the boys and serve as their Lord Protector, which, in royal terms, roughly translates to, "Don't worry, I'll handle everything, especially your disappearance." The two princes were placed in the Tower of London, which sounds ominous now, but was then considered a royal residence, except they never came out. The last time they were seen alive was during the summer of 1483. Shortly after, Uncle Richard declared that the boys were illegitimate, because of course he did, and crowned himself Richard III. no trial, no burial, no bodies, just two vanished heirs. And for centuries, historians have speculated on what really happened. Did Richard III have them quietly smothered in their sleep? Did someone else do it? Maybe the next king, Henry VII, to tidy up loose ends? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that those two children, who once had a kingdom waiting for them, ended up as one of history's coldest mysteries. Their only legacy? A lesson written in blood and dust. If your father was a fallen king, Bedtime could be your last audience. Let's drift on. The Romanovs. The last children of Imperial Russia. Fast forward about 430 years, and the story is eerily similar. Different language, different empire, same tragic pattern. The Romanovs ruled Russia for more than 300 years, culminating with Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. A perfect imperial family, in public, at least. In private, Nicholas was indecisive. Alexandra was unpopular, and their only son, Alexei, was dying from hemophilia. By 1917, the Russian Empire was cracking apart. Nicholas abdicated the throne, and the family was placed under protective custody. That's one of those historical phrases that always sounds comforting, until you realize it means house arrest. They were moved from palace to palace, each one smaller and colder, until finally they were confined in a modest house in Yekaterinburg. They still held family prayers. They still set the table for breakfast. But the guards were tightening, and the walls were closing in. On a warm July night in 1918, the Romanovs were woken up and told they were being moved for their safety. Instead, they were led into a basement and executed, all of them, including the children. The empire was gone. The dynasty erased. And yet, for decades, rumors swirled that Anastasia, the youngest daughter, had escaped. People wanted to believe that at least one royal child had made it out alive, and several women claimed to be heard. DNA testing eventually confirmed that all the Romanovs perished together. But the myth of Anastasia lived on, proving something quiet and strangely human. Even in the darkest royal tragedies, people still crave a happy ending. The Bourbon children. Growing up after the guillotine now, let's drift to France. Because if there was ever a country that perfected the art of regicide, it was revolutionary France. When King Louis XVI was executed in 1793, his young son, Louis Charles, known as Louis XVII, was just 8 years old. The revolutionaries locked him in a prison cell in the Temple of Paris, away from his mother, Marie Antoinette, who would soon face the guillotine herself. At first, guards visited him daily, then less often, then hardly at all. Witnesses later described his room as dark, filthy, and crawling with vermin. The boy, once a prince dressed in silk, was left alone for months at a time, talking to himself in the dark. he died there at the age of 10. And when his tiny body was found, the guards recorded it as the death of the son of the late Capet, not the prince, not Louis. Just a name stripped of meaning. His sister, Marie-Thérèse, was the only one to survive. After years of captivity, she was released, sent into exile, and later returned to France. She was nicknamed the Orphan of the Temple. She never had children, and she never spoke publicly about what she'd seen in that cell, because really, what could she say? Her entire world had been decapitated. The children of the Tudors, the cursed inheritance across the Channel. England's Tudor dynasty offered its own brand of misfortune. King Henry VIII, the one with the 6 wives and a fondness for divorces via execution, left behind 3 legitimate children: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. All 3 would eventually sit on the throne. All 3 would die without children of their own. And all 3 spent their childhoods as political orphans. In one way or another, Edward VI became king at age 9 and died at Ibibondis 15 from tuberculosis, likely made worse by, well, being a Tudor. Mary Rye, his half-sister, was declared illegitimate by her own father, exiled, and only regained her title later, at which point she burned hundreds of Protestants and earned the nickname Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I. Meanwhile, spent her early years watching her mother, Anne Boleyn, get beheaded for treason. She was 2 years old. Imagine growing up surrounded by that level of family dysfunction. It makes modern royal scandals look almost wholesome. When Elizabeth eventually became queen, she refused to marry, perhaps wisely. She ruled alone, and when she died, the Tudor line ended. A dynasty extinguished by its own internal chaos. Royal childhood as a dangerous inheritance. What all these stories have in common is the same cruel irony. The very blood that promised these children power also marked them for ruin. If your father wore a crown, your toys might be carved from gold, but your life belonged to politics. You might spend your childhood being pampered by servants who were secretly reporting on you, or being locked in a castle for your protection, or being executed because your existence made someone nervous, even in peace. Royal children were rarely free. Their marriages were arranged before they could spell their own names. Their tutors were spies. Their futures were pre-written, usually in Latin and blood. And yet, in the quiet corners of those stories, there are small, oddly human moments. A young Louis XVI carving toy soldiers out of scraps of wood in his cell. Anastasia Romanov playing pranks on her sisters to pass the endless days in exile. Elizabeth, Tudor sitting under a tree, reading philosophy while her caretakers argued over her legitimacy. History remembers them as symbols, heirs, martyrs, lost princes and princesses, but in the end, they were just children caught in the gravitational pull of collapsing thrones. Let's pause for a moment here. We've wandered through Cleopatra's palace, Napoleon's letters, and Henry's bedrooms, 3 centuries, 3 empires, and a surprising number of questionable decisions. But the theme is the same. Power and love rarely coexist peacefully. The higher the throne, the lonelier the bed. And yet, in the quiet corners of history, in those faint mentions of companions, favorites, and confidants, we glimpse the humanity behind the crowns. The moments that weren't meant to be remembered, but somehow survived anyway. In the next part, we'll drift through more of them. Queens who fell for painters, kings who wrote poetry to their servants, emperors who found comfort in courtesans, and all the people who shaped history not with armies, but with affection. For now, close your eyes. The candles in Cleopatra's palace are flickering out. Napoleon's ink has run dry. And somewhere in Tudor England, a young woman is realizing that catching the king's eye might be the worst luck of all. His forgotten lovers are less about romance and more about repetition. The same story told over and over by a man who never learned what happiness looked like when it wasn't wearing a crown, a strange kind of honor. There's a passage from a Florentine chronicle that captures it perfectly. It describes a group of grave diggers who refused to abandon their work, even when all others had fled. And when they finally died, the city buried them together. In a special corner of the cemetery, marked only with the words, "It's quiet," almost tender. How did medieval nobles actually smell? Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before deodorant, before hot showers, and very much before personal space. To a world of velvet gowns, armored knights, and banquet halls that, if we're being honest, probably smelled like a damp stable wearing perfume. We're talking about how medieval nobles actually smelled, because the short answer is not good. The long answer, however, is far more interesting, and, as with most things in medieval Europe, oddly complicated by religion, class anxiety, and a near-pathological fear of water. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights, and let's drift back to a world where cleanliness was next to godliness. But no one could quite agree on what clean meant. The myth of the filthy Middle Ages. Let's start with a confession. Modern people tend to assume that medieval Europeans were all filthy. We picture peasants caked in mud, nobles dripping in unwashed silk, everyone just generally marinating. That's not entirely fair. They did bathe. Sometimes. In theory. But the problem wasn't that they never cleaned themselves. It was how and why they cleaned themselves. For one thing, bathing wasn't primarily about hygiene. It was about moral purity. Washing your hands before a meal wasn't to remove dirt. It was to show humility and courtesy. Bathing your body wasn't about killing bacteria. It was about symbolically cleansing sin. So, If you had enough money and social standing to appear clean, that often counted more than actually being clean. A well-oiled beard, a brocaded robe, and maybe a sachet of crushed lavender pinned under the arm. That was the medieval equivalent of showering and cologne. The result? A society that looked fresh, smelled questionable, and congratulated itself for the effort. Why the nobility were often the worst. Now, here's the irony. The richer you were, the worse you probably smelled. Peasants, at least, worked outdoors. They washed in rivers. They owned fewer clothes, so they washed what they had. But nobles, they were indoors people. Layers upon layers of heavy garments, long sleeves, furs, and wool, and because those clothes were expensive, washing them too often was risky. So instead, they aired them out, or rubbed them with herbs, vinegar, or breadcrumbs. Yes, breadcrumbs. Apparently, it absorbed grease. You could say medieval nobles were environmentally conscious. You could also say they were just lightly toasted. But don't worry, they had perfume, and lots of it. Perfume, the medieval masking. Agent perfume for medieval nobles wasn't about smelling nice. It was about smelling powerful. Scent was political. If your room reeked of cinnamon, cloves, and rosewater, it meant you could afford things imported from thousands of miles away. A whiff of musk? That came from a gland under a deer's tail. Ambergris? Whale vomit, aged to perfection. So when you walked into a noble hall, it didn't just smell strong, it smelled expensive. Of course, none of this actually helped the underlying situation. Perfume mixed with sweat and damp wool creates a scent that's difficult to describe politely. Think of it as historically complex. And yet, nobles were obsessed with these fragrances. They burned aromatic woods in braziers. They scattered herbs on the floor, rosemary, thyme, mint, to mask the stench of unwashed bodies and chamber pots. Medieval chroniclers occasionally mentioned that certain rooms were sweetly perfumed, which sounds nice until you realize that they were covering up the smell of 30 people eating meat with their hands in July. Bathing, dangerous and suspicious. So, what about baths? Surely, nobles could afford to wash. Well, sometimes. Public bathhouses existed in most major European cities. They were places to relax, gossip, and, depending on the century, commit light moral crimes. And nobles often had private tubs, enormous wooden barrels lined with cloth, sometimes even heated. But bathing had a reputation problem. Doctors warned that warm water opened the pores, letting in disease. And after the Black Death in the mid-14th century, that belief hardened into paranoia. If you took too many baths, people started to worry. The logic went like this. Bathing made your skin soft, and soft skin let the plague sneak in. So, in an impressive display of medieval reasoning, people began avoiding baths to stay healthy. Naturally, they made it worse. A brief tour of royal hygiene. Let's wander through a few royal bathrooms, or rather, the rooms that vaguely served as bathrooms. King Louis IX of France, better known as Saint Louis, reportedly bathed twice a year, which, for the time, was almost decadent. His confessor even noted that the king seemed overly fond of bathing, a detail that tells you everything about the baseline expectations. In contrast, Queen Isabella of Castile was said to have bathed only once before her wedding, and never again. Her chroniclers meant that as a compliment. It implied modesty and restraint. Meanwhile, in England, Henry VIII was a bit of a clean freak by comparison. He owned silver-gilt hand-washing sets and insisted on perfumed linens, but his court still reeked of sweat, food, and candle smoke, because he shared it with hundreds of people and no plumbing. So yes, even the famously luxurious Tudor court smelled faintly of roast meat and human ambition. The bathhouse scandal. For a while, the upper classes did enjoy public baths. They were social centers, part spa, part tavern, part dating service. You'd go to the bathhouse, soak in warm water, have a drink, maybe a meal, maybe something else. Naturally, moralists hated them. By the 15th century, church authorities began condemning bathhouses as dens of sin. And when syphilis appeared in Europe around 1494, the public quickly decided that bathing caused that too. The solution? Stop bathing. Instead, nobles relied even more heavily on dry washing, rubbing the body with cloth, vinegar, or wine, then dusting it with powder. Because if you smell like spiced wine and tulloch, no one can prove you haven't seen soap since the Crusades. Medieval deodorant. Such as it was, of course, they tried to compensate. They made pomanders, little metal spheres filled with herbs and resins, worn on chains or tucked into sleeves. When the air turned foul, you simply raised your pomander to your nose. A portable filter for a pre-plumbing world. Ladies also carried handkerchiefs soaked in rose water or orange blossom. Men might keep a bit of mint in their beards, and clothing itself became part of the defense. Fine linens were thought to draw out sweat and impurities, leaving the skin cleaner. Which, to be fair, linen is breathable. But when you wear 6 layers of it under fur and velvet, the effect is limited. Still, the idea persisted that noble sweat was somehow different from peasant sweat. One medical writer claimed that because the rich ate better food, their perspiration was of a more pleasant odor, an argument that has never been true at any point in human history. The air of decay. If you walked into a medieval castle, the first thing you'd notice wasn't grandeur. It was the air. Thick, smoky, slightly damp. Fireplaces filled rooms. With soot, rush mats trapped old spills, and windows were rarely opened, especially in winter, when drafts were considered deadly. Servants emptied chamber pots into nearby cesspits, or simply threw them out of windows. The result was a general background aroma that no amount of cinnamon incense could quite mask. Visitors from cleaner cities, like the Islamic capitals of the time, often commented with horror. Arab travelers in 12th century Europe noted that Christians do not wash after relieving themselves, and that their clothes are never clean. They weren't being judgmental, just observant. Because compared to cities like Cordoba or Baghdad, which had running water and public baths, Europe was in what historians kindly call an olfactory crisis. Water as a moral hazard, it's worth asking, how did things get this bad? The answer lies partly in religion and partly in fear. Early Christian monasticism prized simplicity and bodily neglect. Washing too often was seen as vanity, so saints were praised for their divine odor, the odor of sanctity, which was presumably distinct from regular odor. Monks like St. Anthony reportedly went decades without washing, because bathing was a worldly indulgence. And while ordinary people didn't take it quite that far, the idea stuck. Cleanliness was spiritual, not physical. Then, as medical theory evolved, water itself became suspicious. It could transmit disease. It could weaken the body. Better to sweat out impurities than wash them away, which left the medieval noble trapped between two great fears: illness and social embarrassment. One cured by washing, the other caused by it. A word on teeth. You might be wondering, what about their breath? Medieval dental hygiene was surprisingly good. At first, they used toothpicks made of silver or goose feathers and tooth powders made of crushed mint, sage, or even ground oyster shell. But sugar arrived in Europe around the 12th century, and by the 15th, nobles were eating it like medicine. Literally, because doctors prescribed it for everything. The result was predictable. By the Tudor era, sugar rot was the new status symbol. Elizabeth I famously had blackened teeth, which courtiers then began to imitate, darkening their own smiles to look fashionable. There's commitment to trend, and then there's whatever that was. The quiet revolution of soap now. Soap did exist. Better varieties came from the Islamic world, especially Aleppo and Castile. By the late Middle Ages, imported soap became a luxury item. A bar of fine Castile soap might cost more than a good pair of shoes, which meant, naturally, that nobles bought it, and then refused to use it too often. Cleopatra's other men and Napoleon's other woman tonight. We're drifting back into the softer shadows of history. Not the battlefields or the throne rooms, but the in-between spaces. The quiet chambers. The private letters. The people history tried very hard to forget, because every famous ruler, conqueror, and queen has that one name we all remember: Cleopatra and Antony, Napoleon and Josephine, Henry and Anne. But behind those grand, tragic, politically convenient love stories, there were others, people erased by propaganda, or hidden out of embarrassment, or, in some cases, simply inconvenient to the official narrative. So, tonight, we're going to talk about them. The forgotten lovers of history's most famous figures. The ones who didn't make it into the portraits, but left fingerprints on the margins of power. You can dim the lights if you like. Pour some tea. And let's begin with a woman who made love into politics, and politics into survival. Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra's other men. Cleopatra is always remembered as the seductress of antiquity. The woman who conquered both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her wit, her perfume, and allegedly her barge made of gold. But Cleopatra's real love life was far more complicated, and, frankly, more bureaucratic. Before she ever met Caesar, she had a husband. In fact, she had two, both of them her brothers, Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV. It was tradition in the Ptolemaic dynasty for siblings to marry each other, mostly to keep the royal bloodline pure. Although, judging by the family portraits, the purity didn't do much for the gene pool. By Cleopatra's time, the Ptolemies were famous for being both brilliant and borderline insane, a kind of royal cocktail of intellect and genetic chaos. We don't know much about Cleopatra's feelings toward her brother's husbands, but given that one of them tried to drown her, and she allegedly poisoned the other, it's safe to say it wasn't a love story for the ages. So when Caesar arrived in Egypt, she saw more than a romantic opportunity. She saw an exit strategy. But here's what gets lost. Before Caesar, and between Caesar and Antony, there were other lovers, minor players, perhaps, but very real people. Among them was a Greek scholar named Euphranor, a tutor and scribe from Alexandria. His name appears briefly in a damaged papyrus, described as the companion favored by the queen. No one knows what happened to him. He may have simply disappeared, as most of Cleopatra's lovers did when politics shifted. But his mention is enough to tell us that Cleopatra, for all her political precision, had ordinary affections, the kind of quiet companionship that doesn't make it into marble statues. After Caesar's death, before Antony's arrival, she also had a short liaison with a Roman envoy named Dolabella, a friend of Caesar's. It was likely strategic, but Roman gossip columns, which were mostly just men writing mean letters to each other, hinted that Cleopatra's charm was not entirely diplomatic. One senator complained that Caesar's whore has found another Caesar, which, if nothing else, suggests consistency in her taste. When Antony came along, their partnership became legend. Two people who loved theatrically, fought dramatically, and died symmetrically. But even then, there were others. Cleopatra had servants, attendants, eunuchs, musicians. Her court was a hive of emotional energy, and buried in those spaces were small stories that never reached Rome. The poet Crinagoras of Mytilene wrote a short, almost secretive verse after her death. He called her the woman who loved many, and was loved by none who survived her. A little cruel, but possibly true. Let's drift forward now. A few thousand years, and a few thousand heartbreaks. To another ruler who preferred his love letters long and his emotions contradictory. Napoleon and his other woman. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as a man of strategy, order and ego the size of France. He conquered half of Europe, reorganized its laws, and wrote some of the most dramatic love letters ever penned. Mostly to Josephine. You've probably heard snippets of them. Since I left you, I have been constantly depressed. I love you tenderly. I kiss your little hands. And the slightly less romantic. Don't bathe until I arrive. Charming, in a distinctly 18th century way. But Josephine wasn't his only love. She wasn't even his first, and, in the end, not even his favorite. Napoleon met Josephine when he was a young general, ambitious, broke, and convinced that destiny owed him something. She was older, elegant, and already connected to Parisian high society. Marrying her gave him credibility. Loving her gave him poetry. But Josephine had her own agenda. While Napoleon was off winning Italy, she was reportedly entertaining a handsome army officer named Hippolyte, Charles. It's not clear whether Napoleon ever truly forgave her. His affection for her turned into obsession. One of those relationships where love and resentment coexist so tightly that they become indistinguishable. Yet, the world tends to forget the other women who orbited Napoleon's rise and fall, women who, unlike Josephine, didn't have portraits painted or empires named after them. One of them was Éléonore de Nouailles, a 19-year-old lady-in-waiting whom Napoleon met around 1805. Unlike Josephine, Éléonore was fertile, a trait Napoleon's advisers found politically significant, since Josephine had failed to produce an heir. Their brief affair resulted in a son, Charles Léon. When the baby was born, Napoleon was ecstatic. He sent Éléonore a fortune in jewels and declared, quite publicly, that he was capable of fatherhood after all. This small, private affair effectively ended his marriage. Because if Josephine could not give him a son, someone else clearly could. So he divorced her, not in rage, but in resignation, crying throughout the ceremony, according to witnesses, and then promptly proposing to an Austrian archduchess. That next wife, Marie-Louise of Austria, was chosen entirely for dynastic purposes. She was 18. He was 40. She barely spoke French. And yet, by all accounts, she liked him, or at least tolerated him, which is about as romantic as 19th century diplomacy ever got. They had a son, Napoleon II, whom Napoleon nicknamed the King of Rome, as if that could somehow replace the affection he'd lost. But even during his marriage to Marie-Louise, Napoleon's heart and ego wandered. He took lovers casually, almost absent-mindedly. There was Marie Walewska, a Polish noblewoman who saw him as both a savior and a tragic hero. Their relationship was surprisingly tender. She followed him across Europe, even visiting him in exile after his fall. He called her the only one who ever loved me for myself, which, coming from a man who wrote constitutions and coronated himself, is saying something. Napoleon's forgotten lovers tell us a lot about him, more than his wars ever could. He was a man, desperate to be adored but incapable of sustaining. Simplicity. He wanted to be both emperor and lover, both legend and husband. But those roles don't share a bed easily. When he died on St. Helena, alone and complaining about the damp, he reportedly murmured Josephine's name with his last breath, which is poetic, if not entirely honest, because somewhere in France, Eleanor Denuel's son was still alive, living proof that the emperor's love life had always been more fertile than his politics. Let's drift a little further forward in time, and a little deeper into absurdity. To a monarch whose passion life was so scandalous that even his mistresses needed press secretaries, Henry VIII, Henry VIII's other wives, and the ones who never were, Henry VIII is remembered for having 6 wives, which is already too many for most people's liking. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The mnemonic is practically a nursery rhyme at this point, but even that long and bloody list leaves out several women who never officially made the cut. Before Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, Henry had a teenage sweetheart named Elizabeth Blount, often called Bessie. She was charming, athletic, and crucially, not Spanish. She gave him a son, Henry Fitzroy, the only illegitimate child Henry ever acknowledged. For a brief moment, the king considered legitimizing the boy and naming him heir. But Parliament objected, because apparently the line between romantic scandal and constitutional crisis was thinner than one might hope. Then came Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed England's religion and Henry's necklines. But before Anne, Henry had her sister, Mary Boleyn. Mary had already been the mistress of the French king, which apparently qualified her for the English one. She was lively and good-natured, and according to one ambassador, more generous with her favors than was seemly. Henry liked her well enough, until Anne arrived and ruined the mood by insisting on marriage. After Anne's execution, Henry continued collecting wives like political trophies. Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. But among the court gossip, there were other names, women who never quite made it to the wedding, but still found themselves in danger of the king's affection. One of them was Mistress Shelton, Anne Boleyn's cousin. She reportedly flirted with Henry while he was still married to Anne, which, given the family history, seems like a risky pastime. There were also rumors of servants, dancers, and even a nun, though, in fairness, nun in Tudor gossip often just meant woman who said no. Henry's pattern was clear. He fell in love with the idea of being in love, and once the novelty wore off, or the political usefulness expired, affection turned to irritation, then to wrath, and finally to execution paperwork. What happened to forgotten royal children? Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of royal history. Not the glittering coronations or the wars named after flowers, but the long, echoing corridors of palaces, and the small, echoing footsteps of the children who never made it into the history books. Because for every famous king or queen, there were usually half a dozen siblings, the ones politely ignored by destiny. The second sons, the spare daughters, the babies who arrived inconveniently between treaties and crusades, the forgotten royal children. They were born into silk sheets, jeweled cradles, and expectations so heavy you could almost hear them creak. And yet, for most of them, the story ends with a faint line in a chronicle, or no line at all. So, settle in, dim the lights, because tonight we're not chasing crowns. We're following the shadows of the nursery. The spare problem royal families have always had a problem. Succession is fragile. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly reliable. Half the heirs died before puberty, and the other half made it to adulthood just long enough to start a small war. So monarchs did what any responsible dynasty would do. They had backups, lots of them. 13 sonen bertoinen bien heide bien banan. Second sons were called spares. Their job was to exist, just in case, and once an heir had a healthy son of his own, the spares became redundant. It's not a great position to hold in a system where power is inherited. You're too important to ignore completely, but too unimportant to trust. Take, for example, poor Prince John of Bohemia. He was the fourth son of a king, which already sounds like a bad omen. He spent his childhood being moved from court to court, vaguely useful as a potential marriage pawn. At 13, they sent him to France to be educated. At 15, they married him off to someone he'd never met, and at 17, he died of fever, alone. No rebellions, no scandals, just another spare who quietly disappeared from the scrolls. It's almost comforting in its bleak efficiency. Royal nurseries, tiny courts within courts. If you were lucky enough to be a royal child, even a spare, you had your own little kingdom. Royal nurseries were miniature courts, complete with attendants, tutors, and a small army of nurses who occasionally knew what they were doing. Each child had servants of their own rank. A prince might have noble wet nurses and a valet. A princess would have ladies-in-waiting her own age, all carefully selected to make her feel important, but not too important. Parents, of course, were mostly absent. Medieval royalty weren't exactly the bedtime story type. You might see your mother a few times a year, if she wasn't pregnant again. Your father might wave vaguely from a distance before heading off to lose a battle. Instead, you were raised by professionals. A carefully curated collection of tutors, priests, and caretakers who all had different opinions about what was good for you. The result? A generation of royals who grew up desperately formal, emotionally confused, and convinced that affection should be managed by committee. The vanishing daughters. If you were a royal daughter, your life was, in theory, simpler. You were born to be traded. The moment you were swaddled, someone somewhere was already drafting a marriage treaty. Your dowry might include a castle, a few thousand peasants, and the faint hope that your new husband wouldn't immediately start a war with your brother. But if diplomacy failed, or if there were too many daughters, you might simply vanish into a convent. It wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was just tidy. In 13th century Castile, for example, King Alfonso X had 11 children. After naming the first 2 sons heirs, he quietly sent 3 of his daughters to religious life. They lived out their days embroidering altar cloths and praying for brothers who never wrote back, and because nuns were technically dead to the world, their names often vanished from family records. So, whole branches of royal bloodlines ended behind cloister walls, forgotten even by the dynasties that produced them. It's oddly poetic. All that ambition and wealth dissolved into candlelight and silence. Heirs who never grew up. Medieval childhood wasn't designed to last very long. Disease, bad food, and political kidnappings tended to shorten the experience considerably, even for princes. Henry VIII, famous for many things, including his ability to replace wives faster than he replaced heirs, actually lost several children in infancy. Only 3 survived: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. The rest simply didn't. No portraits, no funerals worth remembering, just a brief mention in royal correspondence. The child did not live. And yet, every one of those short lives changed history. Each death shifted alliances, delayed marriages, or provoked new rounds of panic about the Tudor line. So even the babies who never walked still mattered. They just didn't get to matter for very long. The Forgotten Brothers. Let's drift north, for a moment, to Scotland, land of mist, moors, and truly cursed royal families. King James III of Scotland had 8 children. 22 James II became king. The rest became political bargaining chips, most of them forgotten or dead before 30. One brother, Alexander, was made Duke of Albany, a nice title, though it came with very little actual land. He rebelled against his own brother, was imprisoned, escaped to France, and died in exile after his horse fell on him, because of course it did. Meanwhile, another brother, John, spent most of his life under house arrest simply for existing, because in royal politics, being alive was often enough to make you dangerous. If you were too ambitious, you might be executed. If you were too quiet, you'd be ignored. Either way, the family portraits rarely made space for you. The babies no one named. The royal record keepers were surprisingly efficient at recording births, up to a point. But if a baby died before baptism, it was often listed as the child. No name, no gender, no date. Archaeologists sometimes find these unnamed infants buried beneath royal chapels, tiny coffins in rows, unmarked. each one a political disappointment wrapped in silk. To us, that seems unbearably sad, but to a medieval monarch, it was just arithmetic. You produced heirs until you had one that lived. It wasn't personal. It was policy. The children hidden by scandal. Of course, not every forgotten child was forgotten by accident. Some were erased on purpose. Royal mistresses and unofficial wives often had children who couldn't be acknowledged without causing diplomatic chaos. Those children were quietly sent away, sometimes raised by loyal servants, sometimes hidden under new names. King Charles II of England had at least a dozen illegitimate offspring. He recognized some, gave them titles, and even married a few into the aristocracy. But there were others, the inconvenient ones, who simply vanish from the records. You can still trace hints of them in parish documents. A child of noble blood, baptized privately. Or the king's ward, meaning someone who received suspiciously generous support from the treasury. It's tempting to imagine them wandering the edges of the royal court, half known, half denied, ghosts in lace collars, the ones who wanted to forget themselves. Some royal children, remarkably, chose to disappear. One of the strangest examples is Charles of Valois, a 14th-century French prince who, after a lifetime of failed ambitions, simply joined a monastery. Not for politics or penance. He was just tired. Imagine growing up surrounded by thrones and ceremonies, only to decide that quiet prayer and bad wine were preferable. In a sense, he achieved what few royals ever did: freedom from being interesting. His family, naturally, found it mortifying. When being forgotten was a blessing, and sometimes being forgotten was the best possible outcome, during the Wars of the Roses in England, royal children were basically collectible hostages. Every faction wanted a spare prince to marry or murder, depending on the weather. The famous princes in the Tower weren't the only ones who vanished. Dozens of lesser cousins disappeared into custody, exile, or strategically timed illnesses, but a few survived by sheer obscurity. A quiet princess in Burgundy. A sickly nephew sent abroad. By not being important, they escaped the machinery of power. Oblivion, in royal terms, could be the ultimate luxury. The record-keepers and their biases, our modern sense of loss over these forgotten children, comes mostly from silence, because history, as it turns out, is written by people with limited patience for toddlers. Chroniclers preferred wars, treaties, and miracles, not teething or fevers. So the children who didn't inherit anything simply fell out of the narrative. It wasn't that people didn't care. They just didn't record it. Royal motherhood was political, not sentimental. A queen was praised for producing heirs, not for missing them. If she wept, the scribes didn't notice. If she named every stillborn child after a saint, those names rarely made it to parchment. So what we're left with are fragments, a handful of christening records, a few tombs, and a sense that behind every famous monarch, there were siblings who never got a portrait. The nursery as a microcosm, royal nurseries weren't quiet. By the way, they were loud political ecosystems in miniature. Every nurse and tutor represented a faction. Every toy or book could be a symbolic gift from a foreign ally, and the hierarchy among the children could get vicious. Eldest sons learned early that they were special. The younger ones learned to pretend they didn't mind. That combination produced some of the most unstable monarchs Europe ever saw. The people who touch the dead tonight, we're drifting back to one of the most unsettling, strangely quiet chapters in human history. A time when the streets were silent, save for the creak of wagon wheels and the tolling of church bells. We're going back to the mid-14th century, to the years when the Black Death rolled across Europe like a slow, invisible tide. Now, you might think you've heard this story before. The plague doctors with their beaked masks, the superstition, the panic, all that. But tonight, we're not following kings or generals. We're not even following the plague itself. We're following the people who had to touch the dead. The grave diggers, the corpse bearers, the washerwomen, the priests who dared to perform last rites, the ones who kept society from collapsing entirely, while everyone else locked their doors and prayed. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, because this is the quiet, forgotten history of those who couldn't avoid death, no matter how hard they tried. The smell of death and the price of touch. Let's start with a small, grim detail. In most plague chronicles, before you even get to the bodies, you get to the smell. Contemporary writers, when they weren't busy declaring the end of days, described it as the scent of corruption. Not poetic corruption. Actual, physical, nose-burning decay. Bodies piled in churches, streets, ditches, and someone had to move them, at first. That someone was family. When the first wave of plague struck, around 1347 to 1348, people tried to do what they always had: care for their own dead. Wash them, wrap them, bury them near home. It went about as well as you'd expect. Because the moment you touch the body, you might as well have signed your own death warrant. Within a few days, sometimes hours, the same fever, the same black swellings, the same coughing of blood, and then another corpse for someone else to move. So, fairly quickly, the role of handling the dead passed from loved ones to those with less to lose. The first grave diggers in many towns, that meant the poor. Peasants, beggars, prisoners, anyone desperate enough to take a few coins from the city council to collect the dead. In Florence, they were called becchini, in England, bearers, in France, fossoyeurs. Different names, same job. They wore rough wool, sometimes soaked in vinegar. They carried long iron hooks for dragging bodies when they didn't dare get too close, and they worked mostly at night, when the city was quieter and fewer people would notice the grim procession. No one envied them. No one thanked them. Chroniclers wrote that people would throw coins from windows, never handing them directly. Payment by projectile. And when those workers inevitably sickened and died, the next desperate group would step in to replace them. The death cart's one of the most famous images of the Black Death is the cart of corpses. You know the one. A creaking wooden wagon, pulled through narrow medieval streets, piled high with limbs and shrouds. It's an image so familiar, it's easy to forget that someone had to drive it. In London, officials eventually organized these corpse wagons, called death carts, to collect the bodies that filled every parish. Bells would ring out, and the call would echo through the streets. Bring out your dead. It wasn't a joke back then. It was a nightly ritual. People would leave bodies by the door before dusk, hoping to avoid contact, and under moonlight, the cartmen would come, sometimes drunk, often half-dead themselves, loading the bodies, muttering prayers, or simply working in silence. A chronicler in Florence wrote that sometimes they would lift as many as 40 or 50 at a time. And when the pits were full, they'd just dig another. You can almost imagine the sound. The dull thud of soil falling over layers of fabric and bone, and the eerie calm afterward. The untouchables. Of the plague by the height of the Black Death, these workers had become a distinct social class, temporary, doomed, and utterly necessary. Cities actually began listing them in records. Body bearers, pit diggers, corpse washers. They were the backbone of a system no one wanted to acknowledge. In Marseille, municipal orders described them bluntly: those who touch the dead. They were forbidden from entering taverns, touching market goods, or mingling in crowds. Imagine that, your entire existence defined by proximity to death. Too valuable to banish, too dangerous to embrace, and of course, many used this status for, let's say, opportunistic purposes. Some stole from the dead. Who would stop them? Who would even notice? When hundreds died each day, a missing ring or purse hardly drew attention. Others were accused, perhaps unfairly, of spreading the plague deliberately, by looting, drinking, or sleeping among corpses. They were blamed for the very thing they risked their lives to control. Because, of course, they were. Faith, fear, and the priests who stayed now. Not everyone who touched the dead did it for money. Some did it for faith. Priests, monks, and nuns were among the few who continued to tend to the dying when others fled, and they paid dearly for it. In some monasteries, entire communities vanished, one brother after another, giving last rites until there was no one left to perform them. In Avignon, where the Pope was then residing, so many priests died that the Church began issuing mass absolutions, one prayer to cover entire crowds. It was efficiency over ceremony, and the priests who survived were often changed forever, both spiritually and physically. Some believed themselves divinely protected. Others saw it as punishment, that touching so much death had tainted their souls. It's not exactly the sort of thing that goes away after a good night's sleep. The washerwomen, and then there were the women, often widows, servants, or laundresses, who handled the linens of the dead. They were tasked with washing sheets, clothes, and death shrouds. It sounds mild compared to digging graves. Until you remember that plague bacteria can survive in fabrics for days. Washing plague linens was, effectively, a slow form of suicide. One chronicler from Paris wrote that women who cleaned the sheets of the dead rarely saw the next week. And yet, they kept doing it, partly because they needed the money, and partly because, in a society obsessed with cleanliness as a form of moral purity, someone had to make the dead presentable. There's something hauntingly human about that. The idea that, even at the end of the world, people still cared about presentation. The rules of the dead, by the mid-1350s, cities had developed entire rule books for how to handle the dead, not out of kindness, but survival. Venice, always efficient, created special death zones where corpses could be handled only by designated workers. Florence paid men to collect the dead from doorways, but forbade them from entering houses. And in England, the Crown issued ordinances requiring all burials to be at least 5 feet deep. A noble idea. Less effective when you consider that most graves were dug by half-starved men with shovels and a deadline. Still, bureaucracy marched on. Someone had to write the regulations. Someone had to break them, and someone, usually the same person, had to clean up afterward. The plague pits. Let's talk about the pits. Most people imagine the plague as a slow spread through cities. In reality, death often came in waves, so fast that individual burials became impossible. That's when they started digging the great pits. In London, there were so many bodies that the city ran out of consecrated ground, so they made new cemeteries. Vast, open trenches layered with bodies and lime. Each new layer covered the last, until the ground was heaving with decay. Excavations centuries later found them. Neat rows of skeletons, arms crossed, some still wearing rosary beads. Even in mass death, people tried to preserve dignity. And at the edge of every pit, you can imagine the same small figures. Men with shovels, wiping sweat and fear in equal measure, and moving on to the next body. The psychological toll, it's easy to focus on the physical horror. The sores, the rot, the smell. But what must it have done to their minds? Imagine handling hundreds of corpses a week. No priests, no family, no mourning, just disposal. Some chroniclers noted that gravediggers began to treat it casually. One even joked that they would sing as they worked, like laborers harvesting wheat. It's hard to say whether that was callousness or survival instinct, because once you've touched enough death, you either break or you stop noticing, and perhaps that's why so few of these people are remembered by name. History prefers its heroes clean-handed. When the plague faded, when the worst was over, by around 1353, something strange happened. The plague receded, but the stigma didn't. Those who had handled the dead were often shunned afterward. People avoided them in markets. Some were banned from guilds. Others simply vanished, either from sickness or social exile. A few records mention small payments or rewards for their work. But more often, they died poor and forgotten, buried in the same pits they'd once dug. And yet, without them, medieval society would have collapsed completely. Cities would have drowned in their own dead. It's an odd kind of heroism, one no one wanted to acknowledge. They were the invisible hands that kept the living world running, one body at a time. Let's drift, for a moment, from the pits of Florence and the carts of London to the quieter countryside, because even there, away from the cities, death found its helpers. But that is where we'll pick up next. The strange jobs people had in the Middle Ages tonight. We're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a time of castles, cathedrals, and chronic body odor. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's wander through the dimly lit streets of medieval towns, where the sound of church bells mixed with the smell of, well, things better left unmentioned. Because while nobles jousted and priests prayed, ordinary people were keeping the world running, sometimes in very peculiar ways. Tonight's quiet little journey is about them. The strange, the smelly, the superstitious, and the downright bizarre jobs that people actually had in the Middle Ages. So, if you've ever complained about your day job, just remember, you could have been a medieval groom of the stool. We'll get there. The gong farmer, the midnight miner of human misery. Let's begin underground, or rather, under everyone else. You see, medieval cities were not exactly known for their sanitation systems. Toilets, when they existed, were essentially holes in the ground connected to pits called cesspits. These filled up over time, and when they did, well, someone had to empty them. Enter the gong farmer. Gong being an Old English word for excrement. So yes, these were professional waste excavators. By day, no one wanted to see them. By night, they climbed into the cesspits, sometimes 20 or 30 feet deep, with long shovels and buckets, and scooped out the contents by hand. They worked in darkness, by torchlight, surrounded by fumes so toxic they occasionally passed out mid-shovel, and yet they were well paid because no one else wanted the job. A good gong farmer could earn more in a week than some craftsmen made in a month. The catch? They weren't allowed to live inside city walls. Too smelly, too cursed. It was said that you could tell a gong farmer by his hands. No matter how much he scrubbed, they never came clean. So, if your boss ever dumps a big project on you, remember, it could be worse. You could be dumping one on yourself. Let's drift upward now, out of the cesspit and into the streets, where another group of professionals made their living cleaning up what people left behind. The rat catcher, The pest control with a death-wish medieval Europe had a bit of a rodent problem. Between the overflowing waste, the thatched roofs, and the general lack of soap, rats were everywhere, and with them came fleas, and with the fleas came, well, you know, the plague. To deal with this, cities employed rat catchers, men who would roam through towns with small dogs, ferrets, or even trained weasels, hunting the squeaking enemy. It was a risky business. One bite, one flea, one scratch, and you could be dead within days. But rat catchers were seen as public heroes, sort of the Batman of the bubonic era. They often displayed their trophies, strings of dead rats, to prove their skill. Some even got creative, turning pest control into a performance. They'd show off rat shows, setting traps and tricks for the crowd. Occasionally, they'd sell live rats to apothecaries, who used parts of them for so-called medical remedies. And yes, you're thinking correctly. Those remedies didn't work. They just added one more dead rat to the apothecary's collection. The leech collector, nature's blood-sucking. Freelancers, let's drift to the countryside, where another job required patience and a strong stomach. Medicine in the Middle Ages revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, a doctor would try to balance these by removing some blood, and the easiest way to do that was with leeches. But someone had to collect the leeches. First, enter the leech collector, typically poor women, who waded barefoot into marshes and ponds to let the little creatures latch onto their legs. The trick was to stand very still until you felt the tiny tugs. Then you'd peel them off carefully, drop them into jars, and sell them to apothecaries and surgeons. The downside, apart from, blood loss, was infection. These collectors often ended up covered in sores and fevers from their work. It's one of those historical jobs that makes you pause and think, somewhere, at some point, a person stood knee-deep in cold swamp water, letting parasites eat them alive for a paycheck. But at least they weren't in the castle, because royal service came with its own unique hazards. The groom of the stool. The king's most intimate assistant. Now we enter the royal court, where the job titles were fancier, but not necessarily cleaner. Among the strangest and most prestigious positions in all of England was that of the groom of the stool. Literally, the king's personal assistant in the bathroom. The stool in question referred to the royal commode, a cushioned seat with a chamber pot underneath. The groom's duty was to attend the king. During his private business, assist with clothing, and occasionally, yes, wipe him. But here's the twist. It was actually an honor, because the groom had daily one-on-one access to the king, an intimacy no noble could match. They often became confidants and advisors. Several even rose to positions of real political power. So yes, in the hierarchy of the medieval world, cleaning up after the king was somehow a career move. If you ever feel underqualified for your job, remember, one of the most powerful men at Henry VIII's court started his career holding a towel. The Sin Eater, taking your neighbor's afterlife problems for a fee. Let's leave the palace and drift into something a little more supernatural. The Sin Eater was a figure found in parts of medieval Britain and Wales. When someone died, their family would hire a poor man, usually a beggar or outcast, to come to the house. They'd place bread and ale on the chest of the corpse, and the Sin Eater would consume them. The belief was that by eating the food, he symbolically absorbed the dead person's sins, allowing their soul to rest. The pay was tiny. A few coins, a meal, maybe a roof for the night. But the social cost was huge. Sin Eaters were shunned, considered unclean, almost ghostly themselves. They wandered from village to village, absorbing everyone else's spiritual leftovers until, as one writer put it, their own souls grew heavy with darkness. It's oddly poetic. The idea of someone quietly taking on the burdens of others for a living, and also deeply medieval, mixing faith, superstition, and hunger into one sad profession. The plague barrier, essential worker. 14th century edition, when the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-1300s, cities were overwhelmed by the sheer number of corpses. Whole families died in days. Cemeteries overflowed. That's where the plague barrier came in. They were tasked with collecting bodies, sometimes hundreds, per day, and carting them to mass graves outside. The city walls, most wore rough cloaks and masks soaked in vinegar or herbs, hoping to ward off infection. It didn't work, of course, but it probably made them smell slightly better. They worked at night, often alone, guided by lantern light and the sound of church bells tolling endlessly in the distance. They were paid extra hazard money, though hazard is doing. A lot of heavy lifting there. Few plague barriers lived long enough to spend their earnings, but without them, entire cities would have vanished under their own weight. It's a grim job to think about, and somehow perfectly suited to the tone of medieval life, where survival itself was just another form of labor. The almoner, the bureaucrat of mercy now. Not every strange medieval job was dirty or deadly. Some were simply bureaucratically weird. Take the almoner, the official responsible for distributing alms or charity on behalf of nobles or monasteries. He kept careful lists of who received what, how much, and when. It was like being a spiritual accountant. But here's where it gets strange. The almoner wasn't just handing out food. He was also managing the moral reputation of his employer. If a noble family gave too much, they looked foolish. Too little, and they looked cruel. So, the almoner had to carefully calibrate generosity. Just enough to impress God, but not enough to upset the budget. Imagine spending your life ensuring your boss looked appropriately holy, a delicate art, and a career path that could only exist in a world where salvation had a price list. The catchpole. medieval debt collector, and local villain. In every community, there was always one person everyone hated. In the Middle Ages, that was the catchpole, essentially a debt collector. The catchpole's job was to find and extract unpaid taxes, or fines. The name comes from the Old French chasse-poule, literally, chicken chaser, because the job was about as dignified as it sounds. They were allowed to seize property, livestock, and occasionally people. Naturally, this didn't make them popular. There are records of catchpoles being beaten, robbed, or thrown into rivers by angry townsfolk. But someone had to do it. And in a world obsessed with hierarchy and order, the dirty work always fell to the same types of people. If you were strong, poor, and not overly concerned with being liked, the crown had a job for you. The fuller, medieval laundry. But worse, finally, let's end this first part with a job that sounds innocent, until you know what it involved. The fuller was responsible for cleaning and thickening newly woven woolen cloth. To do this, they used a process called fulling, which meant trampling the cloth in vats, filled with a mixture of water, clay, and human urine. Why urine? Because it contains ammonia, which helps clean and whiten the wool. So every town had people collecting urine in buckets for the fullers. Sometimes a small tax was even placed on it.